My mother took my boyfriend away from me, but when we talked about it, she suggested that we split the boyfriend between the two of us. I grew up in a tiny one-room apartment with my mother. My father was never part of the picture. He left before I was even born. It was just me and her, and that was fine for a while. But as I got older, I started noticing the men. Different guys would show up at our place all the time. I hated it. They'd crash on our single bed, eat our food, and worst of all, they'd pick on me. They'd call me fatherless, or ask where my dad was, like it was some kind of joke. It stung every time. We didn't have much space, just the one bed, so I'd end up sleeping next to my mother and whoever she brought home that night. It was cramped and awkward, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, wishing I could disappear. Things didn't get better as I grew up. The apartment stayed the same, and so did her habits. I'd come home from school and find some random guy lounging around, acting like he owned the place. My mother didn't seem to care how I felt about it. She'd just tell me to deal with it because we didn't have anywhere else to go. I started resenting her for it. The constant stream of men, the lack of privacy, the way they treated me, it all piled up. I didn't have a room to escape to, just that one bed and the same four walls closing in on me every day. Eventually it got to be too much. When I was around 12, my mother's brother, my uncle, stepped in. He and his wife offered to take me in. They had a small house a few miles away, nothing fancy, but it had actual rooms and a bed that wasn't shared with strangers. My mother didn't fight it. She just nodded and said it might be better for me. I was thrilled. Packing my stuff and leaving that apartment felt like breaking out of a cage. I didn't even look back when I walked out the door. Living with my uncle's family changed everything. For the first time, I had space to breathe. They were kind to me, treated me like I belonged. I didn't have to deal with my mother's boyfriends or the chaos of that one-room life anymore. It was quiet, stable, and I could finally focus on being a kid. I still saw my mother sometimes. She'd call or I'd visit, but it wasn't the same. The distance made it easier to deal with her. I wasn't in the middle of her mess anymore, and that made me less angry. Over time, we started getting along better. Without all the tension of living together, we could talk like normal people. Maybe even friends. Living with my uncle's family gave me a chance to start over. I went to a new school, made some friends, and kept my head down. My mother stayed in that one-room apartment, doing her thing. I'd see her every couple of weeks. Sometimes she'd come by my uncle's place, sometimes I'd go to hers. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. She'd tell me about her life, her latest boyfriend, whatever job she was holding down that month. I'd listen and nod, happy to keep things light. The years went by like that, and I got used to it. By the time I was 18, we'd settled into this weird but okay friendship. I didn't judge her anymore, I just let her be. That's when I met him. His name was Daniel. We crossed paths at a coffee shop near my school. I was grabbing a drink after class, and he was there with some friends. He caught my eye, tall, dark hair, easy smile. We started talking, and it turned out he went to a college nearby. He was from a solid family. His parents were still married, owned a house, the whole deal. It was different from what I'd grown up with, and I liked that. We hit it off fast. First, it was just hanging out, grabbing food, watching movies. Then it got serious. He asked me out officially a few months later, and I said yes without even thinking. Daniel was great. He was smart, funny, and didn't care about my messy past. I told him bits and pieces, about my mom, the apartment, moving in with my uncle. He listened and didn't make a big deal out of it. It felt good to have someone like that. We'd spend hours together, and I started picturing a future with him. Not anything crazy, just something steady. I'd never had that before, and it was nice to think about. My uncle and aunt liked him too. They teased me about bringing home such a good catch. Things were going well, better than I'd expected. After about 6 months, I decided it was time for him to meet my mother. We were friends now, me and her, so I figured it'd be fine. I wanted her to see I was doing okay, that I'd found someone decent. I told Daniel about it, and he was cool with it. We set a day to visit her at the apartment. I wasn't nervous, not really. I thought it'd be a quick thing, say hi, chat for a bit, leave. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. But I didn't. The day we went to my mother's place, I didn't think much of it. Daniel drove us over in his beat-up hatchback. The apartment was the same as always, cramped, cluttered, a little musty. My mother was waiting for us, wearing this bright red top that stood out against the faded walls. She smiled big when we walked in, gave me a quick hug, then turned to Daniel. She shook his hand and held it a second too long. I noticed but didn't say anything. We sat down on the old couch, the three of us squeezed in because there wasn't much furniture. She offered us soda, and we took it. She started asking Daniel questions right away. Basic stuff at first, where he went to school, what he was studying. He answered politely, told her he was into engineering, that he liked fixing things. She nodded, kept smiling, then the questions got weird. She asked if he worked out, how often he saw his family, if he liked older women. That last one made me blink. Daniel laughed it off, said something about his mom being the only older woman in his life. My mother chuckled, but her eyes stayed on him. I shifted on the couch, feeling off, but I didn't call it out. Then she asked for his number. She said it was for emergencies, in case she couldn't reach me and needed to get in touch. I didn't buy it. My phone worked fine, and she never needed a backup plan before. Daniel didn't hesitate, just pulled out his phone and swapped numbers with her. I watched it happen, my stomach twisting a little. The rest of the visit was short. She told him he should come back sometime, that she could use help moving a shelf or something. He said sure, no problem. We left after 20 minutes, and I didn't say much on the drive back. Daniel didn't seem to notice anything weird. That night I couldn't shake it. The way she looked at him, the questions, the number thing, it all stuck with me. I told myself I was overreacting. She was just being friendly, maybe too friendly, but that was her. She'd always been loud and flirty with people. I decided to let it go. Daniel was my boyfriend, not hers. I trusted him. Still, it sat in the back of my head, nagging at me. I should have listened to that feeling. A few days after the visit, things started shifting. Daniel brought up my mother in random conversations. It wasn't anything big at first, just small comments. He'd ask how she was doing, if she'd mentioned him, stuff like that. I'd answer short and change the subject. But it kept happening. One night, we were grabbing pizza, and he asked if she'd ever fixed that shelf she talked about. I said I didn't know, hadn't talked to her since. He nodded, took a bite, and didn't push it. Still, it bothered me. Why was he thinking about her? Then I found out they were texting. It came up casually. He left his phone on the table, screen up, and I saw her name pop up. I didn't read the message, didn't want to snoop, but I asked him about it. He said she'd reached out a couple days after we visited, just to say thanks for coming by. They'd kept talking since then. He shrugged it off, said it was no big deal. I asked what they talked about. He said random things, her job, his classes, the shelf. I didn't like it, but I didn't have proof of anything weird. I told myself to chill. She was my mom, he was my boyfriend. Nothing was going on. But it didn't stop. A week later, he told me he was going over to her place. She'd asked him to help with that shelf, and he'd said yes. I wasn't invited. He didn't say it like that, just mentioned he was swinging by after class. I asked why she didn't call me about it. He said she texted him directly, figured it was easier. I nodded, kept my face blank, but inside I was mad. He went that afternoon, stayed a couple hours, came back saying it was fine. She'd made him coffee, they chatted, he'd moved the shelf. That was it, he said. I didn't ask more, didn't want to sound paranoid. It happened again the next week. This time, it was something about her TV, couldn't get it working, needed his help. He went over again. I stayed quiet, but the pattern was clear. My mother was pulling him in, and he was going along with it. I started wondering what she was saying to him, what he was thinking. The trust I'd had in both of them was cracking, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The more Daniel went to my mother's place, the worse it got. He'd come back and mention her every time. She'd said this, she'd cooked that, she'd laughed at some joke he made. It was like he couldn't stop talking about her. I'd sit there, nodding, trying not to snap. Meanwhile, our time together started feeling different. He wasn't as focused on me. His phone would buzz, he'd check it, smile, and I'd know it was her. I didn't ask to see the text anymore. I was too afraid of what I'd find. My mother wasn't helping. When I'd call her, she'd bring him up too. She'd say how nice he was, how helpful, how he'd fixed her TV and stayed for dinner. She'd go on about what a good guy he was, like she was proud of him. It made my skin crawl. I'd cut the calls short, say I had to go, and hang up before I lost it. The friendship we'd built was slipping away, replaced by this weird competition I didn't sign up for. I couldn't tell if she was clueless or doing it on purpose. I started checking his schedule. Not proud of it, but I'd ask where he was going, what he was up to. Most of the time, it was school or work. But then there'd be these gaps. Afternoons he'd say he was busy. Evenings he'd be vague about. I'd text him, get slow replies. One time, I called while he was at her place. He picked up, said he was helping her with groceries, sounded normal. I heard her voice in the background, laughing. I hung up fast. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe right. It hit me then, they were spending more time together than we were. My boyfriend and my mother. The guy I'd brought into my life was drifting toward her, and I was just watching it happen. I couldn't keep pretending it was fine. I needed answers. I thought about confronting him first, but I decided on her instead. She was the one who started this, with her questions and her number grab. I had to know what she was thinking, what her game was. So I made up my mind, I'd go to the apartment and talk to her, face to face. No more dodging it. I went to my mother's apartment the next day. Daniel wasn't there. I'd checked with him first, said I was just curious about his plans. He said he was at school, and I believed him. I didn't call ahead to warn her. I wanted to catch her off guard, see her real reaction. When I got there, she was alone, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea. The place smelled like cigarettes and cheap perfume, same as always. She looked surprised when I walked in but waved me over like it was no big deal. I sat down across from her on a wobbly chair. I didn't waste time. I told her I'd noticed how much Daniel was coming around. I said it was weird, that he was my boyfriend, not her handyman. She put her cup down, leaned back, and looked at me. Her face didn't change much, no guilt, no panic. She just listened. I kept going, said he'd been talking about her nonstop, that they were texting, that it felt like something was off. I asked her straight, what was going on? I needed her to explain it. She didn't deny anything. She admitted she liked him. Said he was charming, helpful, different from the guys she usually met. She told me she'd started texting him because he was easy to talk to, and he'd offered to help with stuff around the apartment. She said it wasn't planned, just happened. I stared at her, waiting for more. Then she dropped it. She was interested in him, like really interested. My stomach flipped. I asked what that meant, if she was trying to take him from me. She shook her head, said it wasn't like that. Her next words floored me. She suggested we split him. She said he could be with both of us, me as his girlfriend, her as whatever she was thinking. She called it an open thing. Said it could work if I was okay with it. I couldn't believe it. My own mother was sitting there, calm as anything, telling me to share my boyfriend with her. I told her no, that was insane, that I wasn't into that. She shrugged, said it was just an idea, that she didn't want me mad. But she didn't back off either. I left without saying much else, head spinning. I couldn't process it right away. My mother's suggestion kept replaying in my head, split Daniel between us, like he was some kind of timeshare. It made me sick. I didn't talk to her for a few days after that. I needed space to figure out what to do. But I couldn't avoid Daniel. He texted me that night, asked how I was. I said fine, kept it short. I didn't tell him about the conversation yet. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, or if he even knew what she'd proposed. I had to talk to him, though. He was the other half of this mess. 2 days later, I asked him to meet me at the coffee shop where we'd started. He showed up on time, same easy smile, no clue what was coming. We got drinks and sat in the back. I didn't beat around it. I told him I'd talked to my mother, that she'd admitted she liked him, that she'd suggested sharing him. His face changed fast. He looked confused, then uncomfortable. He said he didn't know she'd said that to me. I asked if he knew she was into him. He paused, then said yeah, he'd picked up on it. She'd flirted a little, dropped hints, but he hadn't thought much of it. I pressed him. I asked why he kept going over there, why he was texting her so much. He said at first it was just to help, but then he liked talking to her. She was fun, he said, different. I asked if he liked her back. He didn't answer right away, just stared at his coffee. That silence told me enough. I pushed harder. Did he want to be with her? He said he didn't know, that he cared about me, but he wasn't sure what he felt anymore. My chest tightened. I told him he had to pick me or her. I wasn't doing some weird split deal. He looked at me, then down again. He said he needed time to think. I didn't let it sit. I told him no, he had to decide now. He rubbed his face, sighed, and said he'd go with her. Just like that. 6 months with me, and he picked my mother. I got up, left my coffee on the table, and walked out. He didn't follow. I didn't cry when I left the coffee shop. I wanted to, but nothing came out. I just walked home, hands in my pockets, staring at the ground. My head was a mess, Daniel picking my mother, her suggesting we split him, all of it. I got back to my uncle's place and went straight to my room. I didn't tell them what happened. They'd ask questions, and I wasn't ready to explain how my boyfriend dumped me for my mom. I lay on my bed for hours, scrolling my phone, trying to distract myself. It didn't work. The next day, I blocked Daniel's number. I didn't want to hear from him, not an apology, not an explanation, nothing. I blocked my mother too. I couldn't deal with her voice, her excuses, her acting like this was normal. I stayed off social media for a while after that. I knew he'd probably show up at her place again, and I didn't want to risk seeing some post about it. My uncle noticed I was quiet, asked if I was okay. I said yeah, just tired. He didn't push, and I was glad. Weeks went by. I threw myself into school and work. I picked up extra shifts at the diner where I'd been part-time, kept my grades up. It kept me busy. My friends asked about Daniel, why we weren't hanging out anymore. I told them we broke up, didn't say more. They didn't pry, which I appreciated. I started feeling a little normal again, like I could breathe without thinking about him or her every second. But it still hurt. I'd see a guy with dark hair and think of him, or hear a laugh like hers and tense up. Then I heard they were official. My cousin, my uncle's kid, mentioned it offhand. She'd seen them at the grocery store, holding hands. She didn't know the whole story, just thought it was weird my ex was with my mom. I nodded, acted like it didn't faze me. Inside, it was a punch to the gut. I pictured them in that tiny apartment, on that one bed, and it made me want to scream. I didn't confront them. They'd made their choice, and I wasn't going to beg for scraps of dignity. It's been a few months since all that went down. I'm still at my uncle's place, still working at the diner, still keeping my head above water. Daniel and my mother are together. I don't know the details, don't want to. My cousin brings it up sometimes, says she saw them at the park, or the gas station. I just shrug now. It doesn't hit as hard anymore. I've gotten used to the idea that they're a thing, even if it's still messed up in my head. I don't check their socials, don't call, don't visit. They're out of my life, and I'm keeping it that way. I've been focusing on me instead. Work steady, I've saved up a little, enough to think about moving out soon. School's going fine too. I'm not failing anything, which feels like a win. I've started hanging out with friends more, people who don't know the whole story. They don't ask about my family or my ex, and I like it that way. I even went on a date last week, nothing serious, just a guy from class. It was nice, normal. No weird baggage, no mothers involved. I'm not rushing into anything though. I need time to trust again. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. My mother's always been like that, taking what she wants, not caring who's in the way. I thought our friendship meant something, but it didn't stop her. And Daniel, he could have said no, could have stayed with me. He didn't. I don't blame myself for it, not anymore. They chose each other, and I'm choosing to move on. It's not easy, some days I still feel the sting, but I'm getting there. I don't need them to be okay. One day, I might run into them. Small town, bound to happen. I've thought about what I'd do. I won't yell or cry or make a scene. I'll just keep walking. They don't get to have power over me anymore. I'm building something better, my own life, my own rules. That's where I'm at now. Not perfect, not healed, but forward. And that's enough.